Let's talk about what the heck is conditional logic. So the best way to illustrate this that I have found is with a children's book, actually, which we're probably all familiar with at some point in our life. We've read the book, If You Give a Mouse a Cookie. And if you haven't read this book, shame on you. Not really, but you should definitely read it because it is a real page turner. But the idea of this book, If You Give a Mouse a Cookie, is very simple. If you give a mouse a cookie, he's going to want a glass of milk to go with it. That's basically the whole book. So sorry I spoiled it for you there, but like I said, it's a good one. In any case, the idea of conditional logic is if this, then that, right? If this is true, then this other thing is also true. If A is true, B is also true, right? We're working through that idea of conditional logic. Now, the ramifications of this are much bigger than the statement of if this, then that. And I'm sure we've all seen this in our processes because you have a million different potential scenarios that this can be applicable in. And you really have to look out for it because sometimes these scenarios can sneak up on you. There's also the potentiality that your conditional scenarios are so minute and unlikely to happen that you might be like us and nerd out about building a super cool process and make this ultra exclusive, rare conditional scenario, and then find out that's not actually bringing any value because it never happens. So we don't want to overbuild our processes around conditional logic. But regardless, conditional logic can still be of high value, particularly in routing your processes and building out kind of the different stages of your process. So that'll be a tangent in our conversation that we'll get into. But Mike, pivoting over to you for a minute here, I'd love to hear you riff for a minute on conditional logic in theory and what you find to be most valuable about conditional logic in property management processes.
Yeah. For me, conditional logic, it takes the guesswork out of a process. So when we're looking at a process that's not well documented, we ultimately end up with a lot of questions. What do I do when scenario A happens? What do I do if the tenant has a late payment on the 15th of the month? Do I send a 5-day notice? What kind of policies does my company have around a particular scenario? And that means I have to go bug someone to figure out what's going on and then learn it. And then next time another situation happens, I got to go bug someone else and figure out how to do that next thing. Conditional logic means we can start asking these questions within our documentation or within our processes. What is the scenario that's happening? And then we get to answer that question. And based off of that question, if we built good documentation, we get guided to the next right step. And I think that's a lot of what goes into thinking about a process. I was at Systems Conference a couple years ago with Paul Konkowski gave a really good view of how to build a margarita and how to make one. And he went through these phases of get the margarita and then pour it. Really vague instructions on how to make it. And so his team actually played out what it looked like to have documentation on such vague instructions. And so they poured margarita outside of the cup. They just poured it on the floor, the alcohol. So it didn't make sense. And as he started going through the stages of getting more documented, it started becoming really intrinsic. Get the alcohol out of the fridge, verify, do we have alcohol? If not, then we have to go buy alcohol. And to go buy alcohol, do we have gas in our car? Which supermarket are we going to go to? And based off of those questions that we ask, the next logical step happens. So as you get more detailed in what you want your process to look like, it's always good to start thinking about these questions is what needs to be true for the next right step to happen. So my team doesn't have to think about it, maybe slow the progress down or just run like chickens with their heads cut off in some extreme examples.
Yeah, and to bounce on that for a minute, I think one of the thoughts that often comes to mind as I'm considering kind of future-proofing the process and coming up with these different conditional scenarios is that I think it's easy to make the assumption or to feel like the people who are using these processes in the future are maybe not going to understand the scenario, so I'm going to bring in this very obscure concept, or I'm going to create all these conditional scenarios because the people who are using this maybe even aren't that smart and they are just not going to figure it out. That is not the reason that we use conditional logic. The reason conditional logic is there is to make our life easier. As Mike just stated, there's so many different possible outcomes. Even if you have super intelligent people, no one can remember all of the possibilities and all of the different things that need to be done in your business, except potentially you as the business owner. But even there, the fact that it's in your head is intrinsically unscalable, right? So we create these conditionalities and we accommodate for these potentials so that your business can grow and can scale and isn't limited by, hey, boss, I'm in this weird scenario. What do I do now? Because every time that happens, that's one more sticking point in the process where people ask questions, where your memory may not be perfect. You may be thinking off the cuff, what's our policy on that? Rather than having a link to, here's our central policy document, and here's all the information related to this particular scenario. And here are the various questions that we're asking to get to this conditional possibility. So we really are trying to future proof the business, not because people are dumb, but it's because people forget stuff. And that's just our reality. Now,
Yeah.
Mike, you were going to jump in.
Yeah, it just came up a couple weeks ago. We did a process implementation for utilities. California has crazy laws. Don't know how people who live there do it, but for those that do, kudos for building a company there.
No, no
But
Californians on the call today, so I think we can talk as much
okay,
as we want.
all right, I'll talk all the smack. But they have different rules, regulations, and different ways of onboarding based on the utility company in specific that is managing either that county or that sector. And there were I think there were about like 15 different companies, and it was between either gas. It was like every single company did not manage all the utilities. Sometimes they managed two. Sometimes a company that did water and electric only did water for that house, and then another company had to do electric for that property as well. So they had this really detailed document on what happens for every utility company and how they handle the scenarios when they're turning the property over, when they're getting new owners. And that was incredible. I give a lot of props to that because that document was so organized onto the what if scenarios. If utility company A, then we onboard them this way. It was very easy to put that into a process and tie all the logic necessary. All they had to do at this point is just select what the right utility company for that property is, and all of the right instructions would show up for those particular utility companies. That's a really helpful way of how conditional logic just takes the strain off of how do I have 15 different onboarding styles for different companies in my head.
Yeah, the outworking of what Mike described there was super impactful. Ultimately, on our side, it made it a lot easier for us to build an amazing process for that company. But that really comes down to that individual, that team member who went through the work of thinking through those conditional scenarios. So yeah, super big kudos to, I think that was Amanda, right? Can't remember.
I think so.
Yeah.
Amy
Anyway,
Holly.
maybe it was Amanda or Holly, whichever one of you did this. If you see this recording, you guys are amazing. But in any case, I'm making a little bit of a pivot back to what Mike mentioned a few moments ago about building a margarita or creating a margarita. I want to issue a little bit of a challenge here. And Chris is going to like this because this is our first official challenge. So there's a wonderful video that we use internally to help train our team members on this idea of conditional logic. And while it's not as exciting as margaritas, I'm going to drop this link in the chat. And this is for a video titled "This Dad Follows His Kids' PB&J Sandwich Instructions Very Literally." And the title of the video is horrible, but the content of the video is amazing. And the challenge for those of you on the call and anybody watching this in the future is to, number one, watch the video, and then number two, create your process for making a peanut butter and jelly sandwich. And the goal here is to think about the conditional scenarios. And what I would ask you to do as you're building out this process is, number one, give it your best, right? Think through as many of the potential outcomes as you can. And I wouldn't bother to build this into your software. This is purely a thought exercise, guys. Grab a Google Sheet or a Canva or a flowchart or whatever you use to think through how your processes ought to be structured and work through the details of what the steps are for building a peanut butter and jelly sandwich. And then once you're done, share your results in the group. We'd love to see it. Love to hear different ideas, and we can do a little critique or shout somebody out for having the best one. Maybe we'll do a miniature contest. I don't know. We'll work out the details of that later. But the goal here, again, is just to work through a practical exercise. And when we're talking about building processes, and the reason why this PB&J process is relevant, is that when we're building processes, it's really important that we almost step back from the details of property management. Now, that doesn't mean that the details aren't important, but The goal here is that you are able to look at the process in an objective manner and separate yourself from the emotions of whatever the challenges in that process are, right? And that's hard as people who work in property management, right? The reality of being in the business is that it's tough, it's complicated, it's hard. There's all sorts of challenging people, there's challenging laws, all these difficulties that make it really hard to do what you do. But to build processes really well, the best thing that you can do is to step back, look at things from the 20,000 foot perspective, and then get into those details in a very objective manner. All right, let's see. Continue on with this concept of conditional logic. I think it would be interesting to talk a little bit about maybe some specific processes that we often see a lot of conditional logic in. Mike, maybe you could queue up, gosh, do we have a good applications process that we could look at?
Probably the template we have
Yeah.
is maybe
Could you pull
streamline
that
it.
up? Yeah, last or on previous calls, excuse me, we talked a little bit about the lease renewal process, which has a lot of different conditional scenarios. But the applications process is one that has just as many, I think, if not more, since there is so many different levels and iterations in the screening process. So regardless of what your specific screening process is, again, we want to think about this from the 20,000 foot perspective. What are the various steps of the process and what it could be? And this is just a template that we've built out. It's not perfect, but we're trying to cover all the potentialities of what could be in an applications or screening process. And in some cases, people are using Lead Simple to do the entire screening process, right? Everything takes place here because they are doing it manually within their own system, or it's maybe they're a Buildium user, but they don't do their screening through Buildium. They do it through somebody else. But yeah, let's walk into this process, maybe in the setup stage, Mike. And this is really the big kahuna right here, this first stage in terms of setting your conditional logic. One of the big considerations for an applications process is how many people are involved, right? That's going to dictate much of how the process works. It's going to dictate how many people are on the lease. It's going to matter in terms of how much information that we're collecting. Now, the same information is probably still going to be collected, but we have to collect it times 4, right? If we have 4 applicants, we've got to gather information for all 4 people. So the way that we typically set up this process is the very first question is how many applicants are on this application? And then based on that logic of 4 applicants, then we're going to populate the steps that are set up for 4 people. So we'll have custom fields for contact information for 4 different people. And then when we get to the stage where we're talking about proof of income, then we're going to ask that for 4 people. But there's lots of different conditional scenarios here. Co-signers is another big potentiality here. And there's actually a couple of scenarios where co-signers are needed, like Mike's highlighting here. Sometimes we have a co-signer when somebody shows up because they already know I've got bad credit or I don't have enough history as a tenant, so I need a co-signer. But in many cases, your tenants don't discover that a co-signer is needed until later on, right? They show up, they think they've got it all together, and then they don't, right? Or they don't qualify at some level. And so then we need to accommodate for that co-signer to be added into the process later on. And all of these are different conditional or potential scenarios that only apply when certain things are true. Like this would only apply if there is a co-signer, right? At this point in the process. Excuse me, guys. Whereas if we say no, this wouldn't apply, then it might apply later on. So we'd want to accommodate for that. Now, in this particular scenario, talking about co-signers, while it's perhaps not as likely that we would have someone who shows up, well, actually, maybe we should take a show of hands here before I make an assumption here. How likely, and if you guys could hop in the chat here for a moment, if you were to take 10 applications, out of those 10, how often do people show up with a co-signer versus having to add a co-signer as they're going through the process? I'd be very curious to hear y'all's perspective here. Because sometimes, all right, so for Kevin, most are getting added later in. Yeah, okay. Anybody else? Aaron doesn't do co-signers. All right, there you go. So this is different for everybody, and there's going to be some variance here. All right, adding co-signers along the way is more common. Okay, so we have some consensus here. Most of the time, if co-signers are accepted, they're going to be added later in the process because the tenant isn't necessarily going to know that they need a co-signer. But with this process here, the way that it's built out, we are accommodating that potential that if they do have a cosigner, you can add them at this point. Because if we are saying there is a cosigner and you're starting the process and you're not able to add the cosigner at that point, then you're having to jump forward to a future stage, then jump back, and it's just potentially creating much more mess, right? Anytime that we have to not follow the process is a time when there's potential for more errors in the process, right? So that's why we're trying to accommodate some of those scenarios. All right, interesting. So Bobby, it looks like he came in as Betty. No judgment, but that's all good. Anyway, but yeah, Bobby's got some different feedback here. They typically come with a cosigner. So this is going to vary by business. It's going to vary by your property types that you rent out. It's going to vary by your community and the area that you operate out of. And all that to say, conditional logic is an amazing and powerful tool that allows us to accommodate a lot of these scenarios that we maybe can predict, but we can't always know for sure that they're going to happen. Yeah. Mike, you have any other thoughts to add here related to this process or just conditional logic in general?
To this process, not specifically, but just to highlight that conditional logic doesn't always have to be reliant on just a multiple choice of answer A or answer B. Your delinquency process is another excellent example where conditional logic is just tied to any number, any overdue rent being present. So as you guys are connecting with your Appfolio, your Buildium accounts, a conditional logic is how they're essentially determined to keep following up with the resident while there is still an outstanding balance on their ledger. So when that gets resolved, your logic can basically capture, hey, we don't have a balance anymore. Let's get out of this process. So it also helps your team not have to be manually involved in checking that all the time. And another place are dates. So logic doesn't just tie to specifically when one condition is true, then another one shows up. It can also tie to when something has to populate. If we don't have to do any follow-up to the tenant until 10 days before they're moving in, then our move-in date essentially serves as conditional logic. And those are other areas specifically how conditional logic operates away from just if yes, then yes, if no, then go another route.
Good stuff. I think we'll go ahead and open it up to maybe some questions, guys. What questions do we have about conditional logic and how to apply it to your processes?
I have a question. When I'm building up the processes, you get two options when you're doing the conditional logic. And the two options are all the conditions are true, and the other one is any conditions are true. What's the difference for that one, for those ones?
Yeah, so for the any condition is true, the idea here is that this process or this task will apply in several different scenarios, right? If A is true, then we need to do this task. If B is true, we also need to do this task. If C is true, we also need to do this task. Whereas in the all scenario, it would have to be A, B, and C are all true at the same time in order for this task to be relevant. If one of those things isn't true, then this task would not be relevant. So an example of that, Francisco, might be on the East Coast, there's a lot of different licenses and inspections that have to go on a regular basis for any lease to stay active. And so if those inspections are in process and we haven't received back all of the required feedback, we can't proceed, right? We have to get back the inspection results from this inspection, and we have to have this license active, and we have to have this thing complete in order for us to move forward in the process. And if everything isn't done, then we are to stand still until all those things are completed. Does that help at all?
Yeah, because I'm confused because when I'm building up the process, sometimes when I change that logic there, the process acts the way I want the process to act. You know what I mean? Because that's where my confusion comes in. When I'm building up the process and I'm doing the test process and running it, sometimes I need to change that little part to maybe it's all conditions are true or any condition are true, and then the process start acting the way I want it to act. So I leave it like that. But the thing is that I don't know the difference.
Yeah. Do you have a specific scenario that we could look at?
I don't have any in mind right now.
Okay.
It's I'm doing the
Well,
process.
if you can think of, or if you find something later on, snap a screenshot, throw it in the Facebook community, and I would love to suss that out for you. But maybe let me see if I can explain this a different way.
I would use
Go for it, Mike.
peanut butter and jelly. Like we can only make a peanut butter and jelly if we have bread, we have peanut butter, and we have jelly. So those are all three things have to be true. If I'm missing bread, I cannot make the sandwich. If I'm missing jelly, I can't make the sandwich. And if I'm missing peanut butter, I can't make the sandwich. Or if I use any condition is true, if I have bread and peanut butter, but I don't have jelly, I can still make the sandwich. That would be any condition is true. If
Right.
I have bread and jelly, but I don't have peanut butter, I can technically still make the sandwich.
Wow.
So that's one way to look at it. Something that also gets really specific with conditional logic on a broader scale is once you add conditional logic, the condition has to be true. So there are some processes that we run into where if we don't answer the question, we sometimes wonder why it doesn't show up, why the outcome doesn't show up. If we leave it empty, that is a condition, that is an outcome. So if we had to answer how many applicants are on this application, for example, I didn't answer that question, I left it empty, that technically is a condition. And because my next steps are relative to having 1, 2, 3, or 4 applicants, my system will read that it's 0 and none of my answers will populate. So something to word of caution is to when you add conditional logic, you need to make sure that you set up the system to answer that question consistently so we don't run into issues where we're not seeing what we expect to.
Okay, gotcha. Thanks. So, for example, if we're having maybe a what do you call it? It's a yes or no logic. Let's say if you could put whatever all conditions or any conditions is true for those, it doesn't affect much.
Yeah, so in a yes or no scenario, that's more of that doesn't really affect it because it's a black or white type of scenario versus, oops, am I still in the call?
Yeah, you're here.
Oh, cool. All right, sorry guys, that was super weird. It disappeared on my screen. So in that black or white scenario, either one thing is true or the other thing is true. So it's
Right.
really an any type of scenario. If this is true, then we do this. If this is true, we do something else, right? But if it's multiple things, if it's black and white, that would be an all conditions are true. Both of these things have to be accurate in order for this task to display.
Okay.
Well, Francisco, I'd be super curious to dig into this more with you. If you can post something in the Facebook group, maybe we can brainstorm our way through it and find you a good solution there.
Yeah, sure. We'll do.
Ben, do you think there's also if we pull back the curtain and we don't just talk about lead simple, there are other conditional markers that are also important. Lead simple is a little bit specific on conditions. There's only one operator on my screen. An operator basically means what are we looking for? And if you start looking at other systems like Jotform or Zapier or Pandadoc or any other software, you'll start to notice there are opportunities to have different operators, like is not. So one big one that shows up in a lot of other systems is if this is only show up if the condition is not true. So technically, if we're looking at true or false, if the cosigners on application is not for, show the next task. Another one is a big one that you'll start seeing if you guys are systems junkies is to mess with other operators like any of or none of. And they're self-explanatory there. If it's 1, 2, or 3 all in one space, that will mean a true condition. Otherwise, it's a false condition. And I know it's starting to sound a little bit more on the IT developer side of things, but just to bring the conversation a little bit outside of just Lead Simple and more into your other tools that you guys are also probably using to some extent. Those are other operators that are still tied into the spectrum of conditional logic.
Yeah, good stuff, Mike. Would you mind turning off your screen share for a second? I wanted to show Zapier here for a minute.
Yeah.
So just as another example, this is in a Zap that Mike built for one of our clients. And just to give some examples of those operators, here in Zapier, right, you have all these different options, right? In this case, we're looking for a unit number to exist. I'm sorry, to not exist, right? This is in an automation that accommodates some multifamily versus single family tasks. So in the scenario of this being a single family, going down the single family path, we're looking at a value and making sure that it doesn't exist. If it doesn't exist, then we know this is a single family property, right? If there is no unit number, then we know it's a single family property. Versus if there is a unit number, right? You can see here, unit 0 exists, then we know it does exist, so it's a multifamily property. But there's lots of different options here, right? There's exists and does not exist, whereas does not contain exactly matches, does not exactly match, all these different variations. So we're thinking through all those potentials, right? As we're building out those scenarios and accommodating our conditional logic to handle that. Same thing with numbers and time. And anyway, you can go down a massive rabbit hole here, but to Mike's point, there's a lot of other systems that also can accommodate conditional logic. Zapier is going to be one of the big ones. Good stuff, guys. What are the questions? Or Francisco, did you have anything that you wanted to add to that?
No, not really. Just wanted to know if there's any custom field that you can use greater than or less than. Are there any in Lit Simple?
Yeah, actually. So Lead Simple recently added this for numerical values, and you can set it for, let's see, is it greater than or less than? I think it's between, if I remember right. So it's not a specifically greater than or less than, but you could say between, and then you can have like your base number. So like in Kevin's scenario here that he mentioned in the, oh, I'm sorry, Caitlin mentioned here regarding the delinquency process in the chat here. Another scenario in a delinquency is that sometimes we only want to kick off a delinquency process if a balance is above a certain amount. So if it's over $100 or over $200, then we'd start the process. Versus if it's under that, we wouldn't. So you can use some of those conditions in Lead Simple to either kick off processes or just update the process as you go along, right? If the balance is below X, then we close the process. Or if it's above X, we continue and we take these steps. Great question, man. Anybody else? No? Cool. I think we'll go ahead and start wrapping things up for the moment, y'all. I know we talked through some detailed stuff here, and as mentioned, conditional logic can definitely go down a very deep, dark rabbit hole. But I think a final thought that I'll leave you with is that conditions should be dealt with one at a time. A lot of times when we're building processes, we think about, okay, there's this potential, and then if that's true, then I got to do this, and if that's true, then I got to do these things, and then if that's of those 5 things, if I have to do this step, then I also have to do these other things. That's okay, and that is reality, but in order to keep yourself from going crazy, deal with those levels one at a time, and write it down. Don't leave it in your head. It is too much for your brain to process, because if you think about the potentialities, if you start with a yes-no scenario, an A-B scenario, and then as soon as you go to your next level, you go from 2 possibilities to 4 possibilities to 8 possibilities to 16 possibilities. And that only ratchets up as you add in 1 extra possibility. It just gets more and more complex. So write it down, get it out of your head, whether it's in just a written form or a flow chart or something like that. It's all valid, but just get it out of your head. It looks like Betty has a question. Betty, feel free to hop in here. Looks like you had a question about changing custom field type.
Okay, so when we first started setting things up, I thought everything was a process, custom field, and that's how we set everything up. And then I'm finding that they should have been on property so that every time you do that process, you don't have to keep filling that in.
Right.
But if we change them, because I've changed some before and it really messes up the process. You have to go and find where that field is in every task.
That's right.
And change it. And then you need to delete that custom field so that you don't accidentally ever use it again. But then what happens to your archive things? Does that go away? And at what point in time in the process, like while you're changing that over, things that are already in a process, what happens to those?
Yeah, great
That's
question.
a loaded question, sorry.
No, all good. Very valid questions. And also apologies for thinking you were Bobby earlier.
Oh, that's
Got another
okay.
client by the name of Bobby Brown. He's been in the calls before. To answer your question, yes, it is a challenge to make these changes. I would also encourage you to make those changes because it is worth doing and it will make your processes easier to use in the future. But yes, it does take a lot of detailed review in order to ensure that everything is updated correctly. Now, to address your question specifically about your old data that's stored in those process fields, I would encourage you to not delete that field until you have migrated that data into the appropriate property field. And sometimes that means manually reviewing those and moving that value from one field to the other. But I would evaluate that just in terms of volume, right? If it's like a dozen or maybe even 20 or 30 fields that needs to just move the values over, you could probably do that in an hour and just knock it out and be done. But if it's a large amount of data that's been stored in those process fields and you need to move it to a property field, Mike's done a couple of migrations like that. Mike, what would be the steps to make something like that happen?
Hire Black Sheep Global.
We can definitely help with that, but technically speaking, you can also learn this yourself.
Yeah. So there's
a little context.
So there's an export that needs to take place, right? So you're getting essentially like a CSV version of that. And then there's basically creating a few zaps that will move that data back into Lead Simple in the right fields. So once, like Ben said, once it gets over 50, 60 different fields that need to be imported, or different fields altogether, like not just one custom field migrating, but several custom fields or different points of information, that would be the best way. Is you get an export of your properties, because that's where you're going to want to push them back into. You get an export of your processes where that custom field is currently living in. And then you basically so it'll have your column. If we're on technical side, you're looking at your column in Google Sheets or your Excel where that field exists in your processes. You would basically port that over to the spreadsheet where your properties have it, where your properties are currently residing, where that information lies. And then the easiest way is to build a zap that's going to map that information over and then start firing that zap manually, which is essentially creating a third spreadsheet and just copying and pasting the row, and that will serve as your trigger. And option two is, yes, again, you can always talk to Black Sheep Global, because that is a pain in the butt to do. And not a business owner's thing to do.
Yeah, that's not something that we would encourage you to spend a lot of time on. While it is certainly a learnable skill, it does take a good deal of time to figure out. Yeah, I hope that helps, Betty. I know it's not a complete answer, but it should give you a little bit of path.
Okay, then I think my other question is, we have changed a process or added a process, and I don't understand if somebody is already in the middle of that process, if the changes.
Yeah, like you make changes to an existing process, will it reflect on the ongoing process?
Let's just say we have a process and we've got 10 different people in the middle of the process at some point in time, but we add a task. Sometimes it seems like it adds it to those that are already there, and sometimes it doesn't. Maybe it's just me.
No, that's a great question, and there actually is a pretty clear answer for that. So if you add a task to a process, it will always populate if the active processes are not yet to that point of the process where the new task is. Okay. So let me give clarify it a little bit. If you have a process with 2 stages and all of your active processes are in stage 1 and you add a task to stage 2, all of those active processes will see that new task. Okay. The tricky part is when you make a change to stage 1 while your processes are in stage 1, right?
Yeah.
And in that scenario, thankfully, if you're adding your tasks in the future of the process, right? Let's say there's 5 tasks in the process and we're at task 2, and you add now a task 6, then they will see that task. But if you're at task 2 and you make a change so that task 1 is now different, they're not going to see that change because the process has moved past that point. So if you do make those changes and you have processes that are already past that point where the change is being made, you would want to manually update that process or adjust that process so that task is displayed. And a really easy way to do that is to change the stage of your process to a future stage and then just put it back in the stage where it's supposed to be. And we do this all the time.
Right? Okay, that's brilliant.
That will get it to
Thank you.
Yeah, absolutely.
Stage.
Absolutely. Yeah, just bumping the stages will get it to repopulate.
Okay, while I have you, I have one more question.
Sure, hit it, Betty.
we have a Google form that we send new people when they want to sign up. It's a very lengthy form and it goes into a spreadsheet. I'm sure you're familiar with
Very
Google.
familiar.
And then it will send us a PDF of all the answers. And then we have somebody that puts all of that data into Lead Simple and Appfolio. Can you make a Zap that would take that one line on a Google Sheet and import it into those two places so we don't have to do it by hand?
Excellent question. The answer is yes and no. So on the Lead Simple side of the equation, because it is a Zapier integrated software, you can send all that information from your Google Sheet or from any other form software, really. Jot Form, Gravity Forms, Google Forms, Microsoft Forms, a lot of different form softwares out there. But whatever that form is, you can send that value directly into Lead Simple. There are a few steps to that, and we're going to talk about forms more in future calls, but it's very much possible. With regards to Appfolio or Buildium or any of the other many management softwares, while there are some of them that have an open API, like Rentvine, they are not Zapier integrated. So in terms of using Zapier to send that information into that software, unfortunately, that's not currently possible. That could change in the future, but as of now, that's not currently possible. So in order for that record to exist in your system of record, which is your Appfolio account, you would have to manually input it. Now, while some people might see that as a negative, I see it as potentially a positive because, again, this is another topic for another day, but your system of record, right, your Appfolio account, your Rentvine, your Buildium, etc., should be an incorruptible source, meaning no one should be able to change that unless they have authorization to do, and we know they're not going to mess it up. There's still errors, right? But we want to have that system have a very high integrity. So connecting it to automations directly is something we would typically discourage because we don't want there to be breakage or inaccurate information or something that changes there. To wrap this up, Betty, the last thing I would mention is I would encourage you to consider of the information that you're collecting in your onboarding form, what actually belongs in your system of record versus belonging in your operational tool, which is Lead Simple. In many cases, the data that you're collecting is only relevant in your operational tool, and it's not necessarily relevant in your system of record.
Yes. Okay. And then can I just email you off the thing or something to see what you would charge to?
Yeah. Yeah. We'll reach out to you directly. We can see what we can do to help you out with that project.
Perfect. All right. Hey, thank you.
Absolutely, Betty. Appreciate the question.